Alright, so I know I'm not supposed to say anything, but you're here, so your presence constitutes a question. So you're at least curious. Oh, what is it? Okay, so I'll I'll consider it to be an answer to a question because somebody is here to listen to what I have to say. So I'll consider it as such. So it won't be a violation then, in my own standard, and I can feel at ease with that. I'm not breaking the rules. I'm not violating any standards of ethics here by providing knowledge because I'm not shoving it down anyone's throat. It's just here if anyone wants to see it. And then the trick is that I just can't send it to anyone. I suppose I could talk about it if it came up in conversation just randomly, like, well, what did you do? Well, I did this or something. But other than that, I can't, like, offhandedly just randomly force this down someone's throat. That's unethical. But it is ethically permissible to make this video. So, in the previous talk, I noticed that the Sam said that I had missed something. I contradicted myself. If you listen closely to the last conversation or talk, the first half hour is all it takes, about 35 minutes, and you'll hear the Sam say in the code, in their like subliminal way, that I had contradicted myself and that there was something that I was developing, but I hadn't fully developed it yet, and that I needed to work on something. Right? Well, I figured out what it is. In that talk, I said that you can't relate more than one absolute. That you can't relate any of the absolutes because they're larger than the relativity. They're larger than the relation allows. The relation is necessarily inside of itself because it's an absolute. It's like it's so big that it's bigger than the relation that it would be able to have with anything else would be. So it doesn't leave room for a relation. It just takes all the space up. Now, the problem with that can be resolved through approximation. So I can take parts of an absolute and relate those parts to each other and then build a more approximate value of what the whole totality of it is. But I can't take the entire whole and relate it to anything else because as a whole, it's an absolute. As a whole unit, it's an absolute, but in parts, it can be taken in finite bits. So if you disintegrate it into parts, then you can say, this part, this specific instance of this relativistic image of one of these absolutes is enough for me to have an example of it. It's not it, but it points at it. It exemplifies it. It demonstrates it in miniature. Not in totality, not totally, not perfectly, but it simulates it. It provides a simulation of what the large scale actuality of it is. And while it may never completely be fully accurate, we can have the faith that it's pointing to something in the general gist of where that thing is. So that's why when we all talk about the images of nothing, we can all agree on the rules by which we're measuring those definitions. And we can say, when you say nothing, what do you really mean? And then the other person will say, well, it's like if I have a cigar in my right hand and I don't in my left hand, then my left hand would represent or exemplify nothing. And then I can say, yeah, I see what you're saying. Because it's an absence, it's excluding something. Not including, not presenting, but removing something that it's not there. And it's like, and we all sort of get the general gist of it. Now, none of us have ever seen nothing itself, but yet we all seem to have some pretty similar basic conceptions of it. In part, but not in total. And that's why we miss things. And that's why some of us see some parts of it over here really well, and some of us see other parts of it over there really well, and we don't see each other well. We see the other person's view poorly, if at all. We may entirely miss it because these are absolute ideas. They're very, very, very vast, and there's lots of them. And so you can come at nothing from an infinite number of angles, and you'll always have, a specific example that isn't like anyone else's specific example, but they'll all share the same common traits, the same relation, the same pattern, the same direction that they're all pointing to. And if you were to collect all of those various points, you'll eventually start seeing a line form. You'll eventually start seeing a shape form. A particular structure will begin to appear. And it will never fully appear because it's a totality. It can never become fully imagined, but it can be approximated. And that's what we live by. We have these approximations and we just sort of fill in the gap. And that's basically what we're always doing. And we will always have to do that. We'll never have the entirety of existence in the palm of our hand because our hand would then cease to exist, and so would we. And that doesn't make any fucking sense. So that's why it can't happen. But if we approximate the parts of an absolute and conjoin those, then we can understand what the relation between those conjoined parts are, and then we can understand the totality. So what I chose to do was I chose to take each of these absolutes in a similar vein to how Alan Watts said that they're two sides of the same coin. I similarly defined each single absolute as a whole unit by the conjunction of the other two as if they were its parts. And so the whole unit of being as a totality, beingness or existence or isness or whatever you want to call it, as a whole unit is equivalent to the conjunction of an absence of indiscernibility. It's a specific part of nothing. So it's not the totality of nothing, because then there would just be nothing. But it's a type of nothing or a specific part of nothing. It's a specific absence of something. What is it an absence of? Indiscernibility. And it's like I had said, everything in being is discernible. It's all part of discernibility. So just like they said, it's an idea, it just wasn't fully developed. And so this is the development of that idea. Being, or discernibility, is equivalent to the conjunction between nothing and indiscernibility. And you see how simple and easy that is. It just means that there's an absence of indiscernibility. And that's what being is. It's the absence of indiscernibility. And that's what I think most people would agree with, is it's discernible. Everything that we know of that exists in physical reality is discernible. Now, we may not have discerned it, but it is discernible. It's possible to discern it. It has a discrete edge that we can measure objectively. And we can objectively say, this is a rock, this is a tree, and they're not the same thing. And you can't confuse the two. They're very distinct. Because we can discern those, we can say that they exist. Now, if there were some tree that was totally indiscernible from a rock, then we would probably conclude that the person is fucking nuts, whoever said that. Because trees and rocks are not the same. They're not even close to the same thing. They're very distinct things. And if one were to confuse one for the other, there would be a problem with the person, not with the things. And that's what most people agree with. That is an assumption, and it's based off of, a basic heuristic. It's not necessarily true, but we tend to believe it because at face value that seems to be the case. I can't think of any counterexamples to this rule. I can't think of anything that is indiscernible and yet has some physical structure or form to it, because that's a contradiction of definition. If it has a discernible form and structure, then by its very nature, it has a physical manifestation. That's what its physical manifestation, in fact, is. And so, we can safely then say that in order to define the whole unit of being, we simply take a specific part of nothing, the absence of, and then we take a specific part of indiscernibility, our indiscernibility, and we say that we can join them, and that then renders our absence of indiscernibility, that we are able then to discern everything, that there is not anything there that is indiscernible. And so we can then in turn define the other parts, the other absolutes, as in the likewise manner. So nothing would be defined if we as a whole unit. If we take as an assumption that its parts are made up of the conjunction of being and indiscernibility. So if we were to combine discernibility and indiscernibility, P and not P, and we combine those, the result of it is nothing. And so that's a very distinct statement, because what that says is, if we take a paradox, the conclusion that we draw is nothing, not a conclusion. So that's distinct from saying that if you have a paradox that you can draw any conclusion. And I'm going to be honest, that has always viscerally pained me, that you could argue that you can draw any conclusion from a paradox and it's valid. That's the part that really destroyed my faith in logic for a while, because that's literally saying that 2 + 2 = 5 means that my ass is a chair is valid. And it's like, it could be a non-sequitur, it could be things that have nothing to do with what your premises are. If P and not P, then my ass is grass is valid. And yet it's a total non sequitur, it's gibberish, but yet it's considered logically valid. And I've always had a problem with that. And this is the type of shit that annoys me and viscerally pains me, but at the same time, it's so reverently awesome when I, finally fix it and I get it to make sense in my head. The reason that you can't draw a logically valid conclusion from a paradox or a self-contradiction is because just like when there's only one premise, there isn't enough room for logical validity because the parts don't integrate. So you can't actually draw a logically valid conclusion from two contradictory premises any more than you can draw a logically valid conclusion from no premises or from a single premise that's just assumed and has no justification. There's not enough room for logic in any of those three cases. And as long as we recognize that as such, then we can move forward and we can say, yeah, that makes sense. So if we combined indiscernibility and being, then we would get nothing, because we can't conclude anything because we have this contradiction of two completely mutually exclusive, diametrically opposed things, indiscernibility and discernibility. And you can't have discernibility and indiscernibility occupy the same place at the same time. And if you attempted to do so, they would annihilate each other, and the result would be nothing. Not a valid conclusion, but literally no conclusion. Nothing. Not the conclusion that anything is possible, but no conclusion at all. And I can't help but be reminded of the same fallacy that we started off with, which is the fallacy that you can draw a conclusion from nothing. So the same people who thought you could draw a conclusion from nothing also claim that you can draw any valid conclusion you want from a self-contradictory paradox between two premises that are diametrically opposed to each other. Premise 1 is P. Premise 2 is not P. Therefore, literally anything. And it's logically valid. I disagree. I say it's invalid because how can you say that P and not P is valid when P is not P, cannot be not P, can't be anything but P, and it necessitates that they can't exist at the same place at the same time. And yet we're saying that we can draw a valid conclusion, and yet we know the premises have to be false because they're mutually contradictory. They're mutually exclusive. So we know they have to be false if they try to conjoin the same place at the same time. So the only valid conclusion would be nothing. Because only in nothing could P and not P both be true. That's the only true conclusion that we can draw is nothing, which means we can't draw a conclusion, or it is true that nothing can be our only valid conclusion. And so that's how you fix that paradox. And on and on and on. And, like I say, I'm not like I really am not a spiritual figure. I'm kind of more like a mathematician. I think it's easier to think of me as like a logician, but I'm not theologic. When I get theological, I get crazy. But I have a theology, but it's shaky because there's some days or some moments or in some ratio. I believe in the Bible, but then there's like parts of me that just don't, where it's just like, this just doesn't make any goddamn sense. And I doubt it. All the time I doubt it. But I'm so afraid of it because, you know why I'm afraid of the Bible is because logic ends. And it ends far sooner than you would like to think. The extent of logic goes up until what we're talking about here. We're talking about the edge of logic. That's where all these paradoxes happen. All these paradoxes happen. It's at the edge of logic. And what it means is like, if I were to take P as a given, where it's its own, it's just an axiomatically assumed or asserted proposition, I can't conclude anything directly from it. I have to then integrate it with something else in order to draw a conclusion. Because there isn't enough room for logic in a singularity. If I just assume axiomatically that P is true, I can't then conclude that P is actually true. All I can do is restate my axiom, which is redundant. There's no new information there, so it can't be processed. There's no processing of the information. It's just reasserted. So it doesn't make any sense to assert the same assertion twice and then erroneously and misleadingly call one of them a premise and the other one a conclusion when they're both identical. So, and like I say, logically interchangeable. And if two things are logically interchangeable, then they must be indiscernible because they share all their properties. By Leibniz's law, if you apply Leibniz's law to P, therefore P, then you must conclude that there is no logic between P and P because P is P. And if two things are identical, then a conclusion is identical to its premise, at which point 2 + 2 = 5, and we have no logic. And that's why I say, it's like, when you really think about this stuff, it is so astronomically impossible that all of this just came into being with no God. But at the same time, it's not impossible, it's just highly improbable. It's kind of like how I was talking about the absolutes never being fully conceived of inside any relation because they are bigger than the relation itself. They're larger than relativity. So they can't really have a relation. Well, it's the same thing. It's like, you know, if... Ah, damn it. I put way too much taco seasoning in my taco meat. Okay, I was able to put some of it back. I think I might have saved it. All right, there we go. Okay, so it means that if we say that P is true as a given, then we can't conclude it because the premise is interchangeable with the conclusion. And two things that share all of their properties are in fact the same thing according to Leibniz's law of indiscernibles. And the premise and the conclusion cannot be discerned from each other because they are both the same as far as it being P. Now you can say that they're given the distinction of being a conclusion, but again, that distinction is only valid if we assert that P is true. If we assert it, then we can derive a conclusion after that assertion. But the problem is if we derive the same conclusion as we did the premise, then we're just restating the premise. Because we're not using logic to say that P is true, we're just asserting it out of nothing, ex nihilo. We're just saying it arbitrarily. P is true regardless of whether or not it is. We just say that, and that's how you get given P. And then it's like, okay, so given P, then we must conclude P. No, you can't conclude anything from P if you assert P. Now, if P was a conclusion that you drew from some other premise, fine. Then you can redraw that derivation and claim that it's valid. But if you just draw it out of nothing, axiomatically, then it has no justification other than that axiomatic justification, other than the justification that it had to be there, which is necessarily beyond logic because it's beyond definition. And once you go beyond definitions, you don't have any more room for connecting definitions through logical relativity because there's no more logical relativity, there's no more room for it because now we're just talking about the axiom being derived out of nothing, ex nihilo. So it all goes back into the same ideas over and over and over again. They all support each other, they're all integrated. But when you start talking about how black and white are the same thing as pain and pleasure, you're just being so loosey-goosey that I can't really take you seriously anymore. Because these are so many different domains that are getting thrown in all together as if they were all interchangeable, that it makes the precision that I'm trying to draw out of this argument impossible to ascertain and discern. Because if you're that loose with your definitions, you won't be able to see this. It's just not possible. I just realized that. Holy shit.